Ending the war on terror, how do you end the war on terror is an interesting question, because clearly there's going to be no surrender ceremony by the people who run al-Qaeda. On the other hand, I mean, we can kind of decide for ourselves to some degree when we think it's over, in the sense that we could sort of say, you know, these guys they haven't had a successful attack on the United States for a decade. They haven't had a successful attack in the West since the London attacks of July 7th, 2005 on the London transportation system. So, the problem is also, of course, for a politician to say it's over is kind of difficult, because what if a medium-scale attack suddenly got through? So, I mean, from a political point of view, it's going to be very hard to say, this thing is over. No politician, I think, will ever say it. But I mean, people on the national security side, whether they're experts like myself or can give politicians some political space just by saying, as an objective fact, al-Qaeda and its allies have lost the war of ideas in the Muslim world. They're absent from the Arab Spring. Their organizations are under a lot of pressure, and and maybe you don't need to say it's over. I mean, what do you gain by saying it's over? But I think you can certainly sort of start saying we don't need to. There may be a way to say this should not be the central organizing principle of our national security policy, and we should be spending less money on trying to defeat a threat that is semi-defeated. Well, the Arab Spring, I mean, the underlying cause of the Arab Spring have been there for many, many years. The despair people had about their economic situation, the feeling that they'd been robbed of their futures by these authoritarian kleptocracies that were controlling everything. So, the circumstances were always there. It was the spark of the Tunisian revolution. That sparked the Egyptian revolution. Social media had some role to play, but I think just conventional television networks had a huge role to play, which I think has sort of been. Social media might have got a few thousand people out on the streets. It was live pictures on Al Jazeera and CNN, showing people showing up in their tens of thousands that then got 1 million people to show up. Because they could see on television for themselves that people weren't being mowed down. So I think social media had a role, but I also think just conventional television news had a major role. In fact, while what was his name? The Google executive, I can't remember how to pronounce his last name. Anyway, the Google executive who played such a major role in the beginning of the revolution specifically credited Al Jazeera and CNN for their role that they had played in the sense of covering the revolution, showing that people were peacefully demonstrating, and I think that had a sort of multiplier effect. So there were a lot of reasons, and of course the army had a big role in Egypt because they didn't, they essentially refused to fire on the crowd. So there, success has 1,000 fathers, and I think there are quite a few fathers involved. How will it all turn out is, Yogi Berra said, it's hard to make predictions, particularly about the future. So, I'm pretty sanguine about Tunisia and Egypt, because I think that Tunisia is a relatively educated country with a relatively small population and somewhat European influenced, and the army didn't fire on the people. Similarly with Egypt, Egypt's got bigger problems, but I'm also somewhat sanguine about Egypt. I think the relationship will always never be, it's always going to be complicated, and there's a lot of anti-Americanism in Pakistan, and there's a lot of suspicion of Pakistan in the United States, and some of it is merited on both sides. But this is like a bad marriage where you stay in it for the kids. I mean, we kind of do need each other. Pakistan needs some of our financial support. It needs our help with the IMF and World Bank and other things. It's got a very weak economy. And we need Pakistan's help to find members of al-Qaeda and certain members of the Taliban. We certainly need Pakistan's help if we're going to negotiate some sort of settlement in Afghanistan. You can't do it without Pakistan. So, relations have got very bad. There's no doubt about it. I was in Pakistan just about a week ago, and just when you think things can't get worse, suddenly they do. But I think people on both sides at the sort of elite level recognize that we need to make this thing work. With the death of bin Laden and the Arab Spring, if we should take that as an opportunity to say we can kind of now move on from a decade where our central focus was al-Qaeda. I think it would be healthy to move on. I mean, we're spending, $700 billion approximately on defense spending. I don't think all of it is useful. And I think that, when budget belts are being tightened, I think defense spending, and in fact national security spending, which is another, whether it's money we spend on our intelligence gathering or money we spend on Department of Homeland Security and others, I think I think that when people are talking to their congressmen about where cuts should happen, I think that there is some redundancy for sure, and some fat not in entitlement programs, but in defense and national security spending, which has gone up very, very substantially. At least in some cases 80% increase in defense spending since 9/11. Not all of that was necessary. When the Trade Center was attacked for the first time in February of '93, and they took a big rental van and they filled it with explosives and they drove it into the basement of the World Trade Center. They blew it up intending to bring down the Trade Center. And it always struck me that one of the common links about all the conspirators, they've been fighting in Afghanistan or had some link to that conflict. And they weren't just a disaffected bunch of cab drivers from Brooklyn who bombed the Trade Center for the first time. And so, when bin Laden's name first surfaced publicly in '96, I said, I said to my bosses, I think this guy is the guy behind the first the World Trade Center attack. I can't prove it, but I think he's important. And they had never heard of bin Laden, or obviously he wasn't a household name, but they said they were interested, and that's how I identified him. And it turned out that he wasn't really directly involved in the first Trade Center attack, but his group had some role to play in that, and of course his group would then go on to attack again on 9/11. So that's how I got into it. It was the first Trade Center bombing that sort of sparked my interest in this movement. Homegrown terrorism is a threat, but it's not, more Americans die in their bathtubs every year by significant numbers than die in terrorist attacks, whether by people influenced by al-Qaeda ideas or in left-wing or right-wing terrorist attacks. And al-Qaeda is not the only terrorist group, or al-Qaeda and people influenced by it are not the only sort of domestic threat we face, but the threat we face, whether from al-Qaeda or people inspired by it, or by right-wing terrorism or anarchists or environmental terrorists, all these threats are pretty low. There's a huge amount of activity in the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, etc., to prevent terrorist attacks of any description. So, it's a threat, but it's hardly existential.